Hello and welcome to the eighth part of the Asia and Pacific episodes. In this episode special, we will be covering a broad range of different topics relevant to the U.S. China relation. My special guest today is Adam Bartley. Adam Bartley is a specialist in U.S. China relation and regional Indo-Pacific security. He is the author of two manuscripts examining U.S. foreign policy and China, and has contributed to articles examining whole of government application to Indo-Pacific strategy in the United States. Dr. Bartley has spent considerable time in the United States, undertaking research and at the Library of Congress, the National Archives and Courts Administration, and interviewing policymakers and analysts, and maintains important links with research institutions in the United States. He is a lecturer and regional foreign specialist at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, RMIT, University in Australia. Dr. Bartley has lived in China for a period of 7 years and speaks fluent Mandarin. Our topic today is also related to Dr. Adams' co-authored book of the U.S. foreign policy and China security challenges during the Bush, Obama, and Trump administration. So we are going to talk about his book as well. Welcome, Adam. Thank you for joining me today.
And thank you for having me. Thank you.
For better understanding our program, I would like to go a little bit into the background and history of the U.S.-China relation. So what are the perception of China and White House decision-making between the 1941 and the 1963, and also during the Cold War?
Yep. Well, look, firstly, it's a big topic and one that I could probably spend your whole program on, but I'll try to summarize the main kind of points here. Look, when we go back, and why the World War II is an interesting place to start for the United States, or relations between the United States and China, is because it was at this time, we could argue, and I certainly do, that America was really at the apex of its expertise in China studies, in Chinese language. It had hundreds of people associated who were living in China at the time, who spoke the various languages in China at the time, and had extensive links with that country. Now, part of the problem in World War II is that, and one of the questions that I examine in my manuscript, for instance, which is that how did it go so wrong, right? How can you have so much of this expertise, which had been built up steadily, really over the years since 1915 and even a little bit earlier. But how could you get, how could things go so wrong? Part of the problem was, and part of the problem that we see, in fact, today, especially under the former Trump administration, was that there was this reluctance to listen to the people on the ground. For instance, those in China, those that had expertise, for instance, those that were in the daily communication with people. And of course, we know that, after 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party acceded to the leadership of the country on October 1st, for instance, and slightly after that, when the relationship between the United States and China deteriorated thereafter, that expertise diminished considerably, not just within China, but considerably in the United States. We know about McCarthyism, for instance. One of the first, or the first groups of society to be attacked under McCarthyism in the United States was, in fact, the China experts. And a number of China experts, which were calling for more of a moderation towards the People's Republic of China at that particular stage, understanding that there were situational issues and certainly activities of fundamental importance to the People's Republic of China at that time that required them to focus internally, not so much externally, which is what the Cold War very much was, a situation of external importance, not just to the United States, but to the Soviet Union, not so much China at that time. What really occurred after 1949 was this great division, of that expertise and that knowledge in the United States with China, and that was lost, for the duration of the Cold War. And we only really began to get backed out. And if I'm looking from a perspective of the United States, really in the early 2000s and thereon, and what we're seeing at the moment and why this is so important and topical towards today is that we are beginning to see that again, and especially with COVID-19 now, but also with the new national security laws in Hong Kong and just a general attitude towards foreigners, but specifically China observers and foreign policy specialists in the United States, but other Western countries as well, that these are being discouraged. These people are being discouraged in China. They don't want them. There's a hostility towards them. And so, I mean, we've seen a couple of polls just recently among academics and scholars and other notable foreign policy specialists, for instance, who are deeply hesitant about returning to China. And so, I mean, and when we look at the Cold War, for instance, relations between the United States and China, my argument would be that one of the greatest issues, but also tragedies of that particular time was that there was no understanding, there was no interaction, there was no connection, and that when we actually begin to see that happening again after, of course, when Nixon and Kissinger go to China, but after 1979 more specifically, is that when that connection and that interaction begins to happen, okay, we have more understanding, more engagement, more interaction, and there is more interactive learning there as well. So that's kind of what that particular book is about, understanding the loss of that particular expertise and the impact of that loss on foreign policy in the United States, which have also, of course, was going through a fundamental rethinking of its own foreign policy towards the Soviet Union and communism more broadly at that particular stage. So there were a number of issues to take into account there. For me, the focus has been on that expertise and what happens when that expertise disintegrates. And I would also point out that we're seeing that, I mean, while we have this analysis, right? We can examine this in the American context. Okay, what about the Chinese context, right? I mean, to what extent do they have this expertise? To what extent are they able to go out into the world, go into America, create those interactive experiences, to have those language abilities, to be able to speak with certain policymakers, for instance? To what extent are they creating an environment within China that is not just an echo chamber for nationalists, anti-Americanists, for instance, or anti-Western, or those anti-Western types? And so far, I would say that really since 2016, 2017, I would say that echo chamber has grown, and that connection with that wider Western world, but particularly with the United States, has loosened considerably. And I would say that's very dangerous.
Dr. Adam, what kind of changes take place in U.S. foreign policy towards China from Bush to the Trump administration?
Mm-hmm. Well, my co-author and I, we wrote about this in our latest book, in that we examined the engagement policies from Bush through to Obama and then through to Trump. And it's very clear that there is a considerable break in that engagement policy and really a divorce from it altogether under Trump in 2017 and more specifically in 2018. What we really tried to identify is the process of that divorce, of giving up that engagement policy, okay? Because we know it didn't just begin with the disposition of one president, for instance. We know that there were many occasions, whether we talk about it in the context of North Korea, for instance, in the six-party talks, with regards to the war on terror. Once Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, for instance, 2012, it was the context of the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and of course the Senkaku Island debate, and then more recently and more considerably, Hong Kong and Xinjiang as well. So we have really over the last sort of 2 decades, this process of an attempt towards engagement. But what we argue is that really an engagement on one side, and that is predominantly the American side, I would argue. I mean, certainly there were areas that China were interested in engaging on, certainly in the technology areas, the economic sectors and trade, for instance. The Chinese have been very robust about engagement in those areas. But when it comes to the significant points on things like international security, whether or not North Korea, for instance, should have nuclear weapons, same question with regards to Iran as well. Things about questions in the UN Security Council, for instance, what happened with ISIS, the growth of ISIS, Iraq. I mean, I can go on and on about these, but when it really comes down to the important security questions of international consequence, that engagement and that interaction was hugely lacking. And this is what we see over and over and over again in this 2-decade experience. And so that is one of the fundamental points. And that was really when we get to the Trump administration, for instance, and you get to people who are much more hawkish towards China, but also many, such as Michael Pillsbury, for instance, who lead through these processes, who are much more hawkish towards the Chinese government, for instance. That's when you begin to see, and that's what with a more specific break in that engagement policy towards outright competition, for instance.
Adam, when we compare it to these three administrations, Bush administration, Obama, and Trump administration, what differences and similarities are there in the U.S. foreign policy towards China during these three administrations?
What are the differences and the similarities, did you say?
Yes.
Well, yeah, look, from Bush to Obama, I mean, there was definitely an attempt to continue engagement, give and take, in certain areas. I mean, the United States was certainly and could be quite assertive when it came to Taiwan, for instance, and even quite blind on certain points that were very sort of significant to the Chinese. And vice versa, of course, as I mentioned before, with the six-party talks with North Korea. Obviously, when Barack Obama became president, for instance, in 2009, he certainly wanted to continue that engagement policy, and we saw that. And there have been references to Obama as this sort of a reluctant realist. He wanted to move on North Korea, for instance, and he did attempt that. But when he saw that certainly North Korea, and then after a while China was stonewalling on sanctions, for instance, then he certainly adopted a much more of a harsher, hawkish policy towards North Korea, for instance. And we saw that with the Bush administration as well. And this is what I talk about in terms of a learning curve. We saw when Bush came to power, for instance, he was very hawkish on North Korea and essentially ignored any attempt to discuss denuclearization or even North Korea's nuclear policies for quite some time. And it really wasn't until 2006, after it was discovered that they're very serious with their nuclear ambitions, and that China was we said that we will help out, but essentially going to lead this thing. That was when we began to see more conciliation. And we saw that with the Obama administration as well, and indelibly with the Trump administration, who was again much more hawkish. We saw him calling Kim Jong-un names, for instance. The same goes with Xi Jinping in China. But then again, we see this almost turn overnight towards conciliation, where President Trump wanted to meet with Kim Jong-un, and then all of a sudden there's this trade war with China, for instance. But then again, Trump has this great relationship with Xi Jinping. So one of my key arguments here, especially when we're looking at over those three important administrations, is that there are very specific learning curves in each of those administrations. But what happens is, when you get to the end of that administration, that learning curve essentially dissolves. It gets replaced by a different party in Washington, for instance. That the experience, the expertise of those last 8 years essentially dissolves with the former administration. And we find that those lessons that we had to learn in dealing with China, but also North Korea, that those lessons have to be learned all over again. And that's essentially what we see with the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and certainly Trump, especially when it comes to China.
Did the United States decide to contain the growing Chinese threat exactly during the Obama administration or another time?
Well, look, it depends on what you mean by threat here. Is the rise of China a threat? The United States governments have never agreed that they see China's rise as a specific threat. Under the Trump administration, we had many more conservatives who certainly saw China as a threat, but not so much its rise. Looking more specifically at its military development, for instance, and certainly some of its foreign policies, then you could say that looking at the Obama administration's attempt to begin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was an earlier realization, or we might even say a late realization, for instance, because the Trans-Pacific Partnership had its origins in the Bush administration, at the end of the Bush administration. So it was an attempt to essentially manage the rules of the road in America's favor, because it knew that China was coming to influence the region economically at a much faster scale, I would argue, than perhaps the Bush administration and even the Obama administration had realized that it would. And we, of course, that was exacerbated by, or at least energized by, the rise of Xi Jinping as well, who many, in the West, but particularly the United States and even in Australia as well, really kind of underestimated. We looked at Xi Jinping as certainly, if at least not much more liberal than his predecessor, then much more amiable or agreeable with terms of engagement, or even improving engagement with Western powers. So there was a bit of a learning curve there in terms of Xi Jinping's ascension. So yeah, look, and there's no doubt as well that academics, scholars, and certainly influential policy makers in China viewed the Trans-Pacific Partnership as something of a containment strategy to essentially, I'm not trying to say contain, but at least stymie China's rise and its regional influence, right? If you look at the situational aspects of America's bases in South Korea, in Japan, for instance, but also its alliances with the Philippines, Thailand, Australia, and then strategic partnerships with other countries. Then if you're sitting there in Beijing, then it begins to look like something of a containment strategy. And I would argue that perhaps the American leadership over time has not effectively or appropriately allayed those fears that containment was the end goal. Of course, President Obama rejected that whole conception of a containment strategy. Trump, not so much. So we can see that, yes, and let's not forget that the concept of an American containment strategy preceded the Obama administration, for instance, at least in Beijing's thinking. So if I'm in Beijing, then we're looking at the Obama administration, the pivot to the Asia Pacific, which then became a rebalance to the Asia Pacific. It certainly looked like a ratcheting up of a containment strategy. And I would argue that perhaps the Obama administration did not do a good enough job in suggesting that was not the case. But again, the rise of we can't solely put that on the shoulders of the Obama administration, because it's a bilateral relationship, right? That's no doubt affected by other external international developments.
Adam, compared to the Bush, Obama, and Trump administration, how you can evaluate the Biden administration?
Well, first of all, I think we need to be critical with the Biden administration. Let's not forget that he had been around for a very long time and been involved in foreign affairs for a very long time in the United States as a senator, and then, of course, importantly, as a vice president during the 8 years of the Obama administration. So he has been around for a long time. Therefore, we need to evaluate his options and his decisions based on his experiences, which are considerable. And so far, I would say that where it's July already, so he hasn't been in office for very long at all, and we have seen really since February certainly an intelligent response. And I say that because, he didn't go into office with a promise to simply repudiate the policies of the former Trump administration. In fact, he's kept many of them, which suggests to me that he's keeping a very open mind about, how to deal with China and so the very many challenges of that relationship with China as well. And let's not forget that it might have been the Trump administration who had really sort of attempted to, let's say, manage engagement, especially on trade, under a new basis, right, by beginning the trade war. But those sentiments had been around for quite a long time in the United States. And Biden's, with Biden's basically his policy of not repudiating those straight away, suggests that he's much on board with many of those policies, as many strategic thinkers are in the United States. So in that sense, I would say that he's been smart. He's looking for what kind of what the Chinese can bring to the table. For instance, we saw that in Anchorage in Alaska a couple of months back, and what we saw was that the Chinese were in fact not bringing much to the table at all. And so he is willing to push back, in a manner of speaking, in a way that the Trump administration had been prepared to do. And I might point out at this particular stage that this is probably something that Trump's predecessor wouldn't have been able to do, at least not without significant backlash among Republicans and other sectors of society in America at that particular time. It really took someone of Trump's caliber and his administration to be able to do something. And so it's a bit of a gift for Democrats in the Biden administration that has occurred, and that gives them a lot of leverage to maneuver in terms of what they want their own China policies and strategy to be. So I think we'll see in the coming months, towards August, September, October perhaps, in terms of the development of a more coherent strategy. And I think, I hope to see that much of that strategy is going to borrow from, the Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy, for instance, because there were intelligent minds behind that. And I think there's much to use in those important policy documents which came out of the Trump administration, even if they weren't taken seriously by the White House under Trump. So I would say it's too early to see so far in terms of what a Biden administration China policy might look like. But we have seen early on pushback, intelligent pushback, for instance, more of a wait and see policy as well to see how China reacts. But also we see a focus more specifically on internal issues in the United States. And this is something that we see, with every new president as well. So I think the next couple of months will tell us a little bit more about that. and that will allow us to evaluate the Biden administration a little bit more fairly, I think.
When we come to the Indo-Pacific strategy, what exactly is the significance of and purpose of Indo-Pacific strategy, and has it changed in any way after the Trump administration?
I think we will see some changes, certainly changes with regards to how the administration will see or view relations with Southeast Asia, for instance, and certainly East Asia and even South Asia. I mean, we saw the importance of the quadrilateral security dialogue under the Trump administration, and I think we will see that gain more ground within the Trump administration as well. So, the Biden administration as well. So, I mean, that was a significant development. I mean, other sort of areas of policy, such as, responding to the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, with America's own particular strategy, or I would say, however, that needs more work. We did see a lot of sort of work on the ground that is sort of outside of specific bilateral relations between the White House and other government departments in Asia, for instance. We did see a bit of that under the Trump administration, but I think we will see more focus under the Biden administration on those high-level encounters, for instance, those high-level interactions, because he will want to make sure that leaders in Southeast Asia, East Asia, and South Asia, of course, are aware that the United States is around to stay. With Trump administration, we didn't see that so much. I mean, Trump missed 3 of the ASEAN U.S meetings, for instance, and the last one, which was online, which was via virtual meeting, for instance, he really had no excuse to miss that. And not only did he not send his vice president or his secretary of state, he sent his national security advisor. So this was a bit of a brown eye, a black eye for the Trump administration. And I think it's something that the Biden administration will attempt to avoid. The Indo-Pacific strategy, the problem with the Trump administration for that particular strategy was it was essentially not a strategy at all, but more a policy, and a policy without leadership, or a strategy about how to implement that particular strategy. And we saw that fall apart, for instance, with the immediate decision to get rid of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for instance, before there was even a policy or a strategy to replace it. And so that was again really a shot in the foot for the own administration, a home goal, so to speak, for the Trump administration, and something that we will that I believe the Biden administration will attempt to avoid at all possible circumstance. So, look, I think overall the Indo-Pacific strategy was important. It was well thought out. It was inclusive of much of the security strategy at the United States at that particular time. And I think the next national security strategy that we will see under the Biden administration, whether that comes out this year or next year, I think we'll see much of the Indo-Pacific strategy repeated in there. And that, of course, reflects the focus and importance of the Indo-Pacific in American strategic thinking, but also the rise of the Indo-Pacific as the most dominant economic, strategic, and trade routes, trade sort of area in the world at this particular time and in the coming future, but also the role of the United States there as well. So it was an important document under the Trump administration, but a document without a strategy and leadership. And I think that's something the Biden administration has been attempting to fix. And I'm hoping that we'll see more leadership and strategy with regards to those particular documents And again, something that we may see in the coming months as well. That is, if the Biden administration is quick to bring out their own national security strategy.
Adam, for the United States, what are key security challenges relating to Chinese military modernization, South and East China Seas, the Indo-Pacific region, and the Belt and the Road Initiative, and China's nuclear modernization?
But for me, I think the most serious aspect of China's military modernization is, of course, its non-transparency. We have a number of assumptions about how fast it is growing, in what areas it is growing, what kind of strategy that they're attempting to develop. But what we're also seeing is that there is a great lapse in the mechanisms in China's military modernization, but also its policies and its strategies in the East and South China Seas. A great lack of a mechanism to be able to engage with other foreign militaries in those regions, for instance, to avoid miscalculations. And that is the key issue here, I think, because we're seeing, we have many different claimants to maritime zones, or maritime islets, for instance, in the South China Seas, and certainly between China and Japan in the East China Seas. And if we look at the military modernization just of those two particular areas, they're the fastest growing regions in the world in terms of military modernization, not just for China, but for many of those other countries as well. You see that in Japan, for instance, under first Shinzo Abe, and now Prime Minister Suga, for instance. But we see that also very clearly in Vietnam, in the Philippines, and in Indonesia as well. So, look, it's a huge flashpoint, and this is what is very challenging and I think very serious, because I think Beijing has been very blasé about its military modernization. I think they've been far too careless in terms of the miscalculation and even the accidents that can take place when you have such a heightened number of military vessels, for instance, operating in those waters. Another point, for instance, we're seeing increasingly large quantities of military jets infiltrating Taiwanese airspace, for instance. That has been a major concern for the United States. It's something that we're talking about here a lot in Australia, and certainly in Japan as well, because we have defensive agreements with the United States, which has something of a defensive agreement, however vague, with Taiwan as well. And this is part of the problem. And we've seen discussion here in Australia, for instance, about whether or not the ANZUS alliance, for instance, will necessitate some kind of response from Australia if there is an attack, whether that is a direct concerted attack by the Chinese Communist Party on Taiwan, or whether that is something of a miscalculation or an accident that escalates to some kind of larger land or maritime war there. So I think that is very worrisome, and I think China's lack of transparency in terms of its military modernization is very concerning, and I think it's something that's going to and has been worrying military strategists, for instance, deeply at the moment, but also in the coming years as well. And even responding, let's say, to Xi Jinping's recent speech at the 100th centenary anniversary, for instance, of the founding of the People's Republic of China, for instance. There are some worrying signs, heightened rhetoric around the growth of China's military, but also how it might respond to something like a Taiwan Strait crisis, for instance. So that is deeply concerning, and something that analysts like myself are looking at considerably.
Adam, will China succeed in changing the security architecture in East and South China Sea to its advantage? What's your view?
Look, I think it could have. I think if we go back 5 or 6 years, I think that if it had made a number of different decisions about certain issues, certain foreign policies, for instance, I think perhaps it could have. I think really in the last couple of years, however, and certain decisions that China's made, again, with regards to Hong Kong, for instance, the national security law, with regards to Xinjiang and its sinicization laws and policies there, with regards to the South China Seas and certainly with regards to the bilateral relationship with Australia, for instance. I think if we go back prior to those particular flashpoints, those incidences, then I would say that yes, it could have changed for the better the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, whichever you want to call it. I think now it's going to be much more difficult to do so. I think China's wolf warrior diplomacy, for instance, has been very negative, and it has been picked up in foreign governments and foreign cities around the world as really a reflection of China's perhaps own internal situation, but also its intentions for what it seeks as a major global power. And that doesn't look so benevolent when you have ambassadors around the world blaming foreign governments for their own COVID responses, for instance, or for simply protecting their own national security interests, such as in Australia, for instance, and the decision to not allow Huawei to basically have access to national grids, for instance, which is something certainly the Chinese government would never allow to happen. Let's say if Ericsson, for instance, or Motorola were attempting to bid for development of 5G in China, it just wouldn't happen. There's no point in even thinking about it. So I think their reaction to that decision in Australia, their reaction to the trade war, I thought could have certainly been a lot better. I mean, just to give you just to go back to the Australian example, for instance, if it had stood back a little bit and said, well, that's your prerogative, that's in your natural interest, we respect your decision, it is what it is type thing, then I think we would have seen a lot of other countries sort of agree with Beijing's decision there. You might have been a bit upset, and it could have reduced trade, slapped Australia on the wrist, or Canberra on the wrist, for instance, for some policies that it adopted that aggravated the Chinese, but it didn't do that. In fact, it reacted very differently in very much an opposite manner, which made it look like a bully, and a very aggressive bully. And governments around the world have certainly wisened up to that particular response, and we've seen that again more aggressively in the wolf warrior diplomacy, for instance. So I would say there certainly was a window where China could have made that security architecture a little bit more in its favor. But I would say that has now definitely gone. And we've seen with the rise, for instance, of the quadrilateral security dialogue, and certainly Australia's attempt at greater interaction with ASEAN, for instance, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but also among India and Japan as well, and certainly the United States in that Indo-Pacific region to basically to compete with China more specifically and more strategically in that space. So I think China's lost that window of opportunity there. and basically it may not get better for the United States, for instance, but it certainly won't get better for China either. I think we will see losers all around, and I think we'll see that the security architecture, that particular status quo, it may be livable, but it certainly won't be optimal. We will have to essentially satisfy the situations to say, essentially seek satisfactory terms that are not necessarily optimal for any party, and that's what I think we'll see in the coming future in terms of that security architecture. A lot of it, I think, will also reflect on ASEAN's choices as well, in terms of how it will respond to the quadrilateral security dialogue, and how it will respond to China.
Adam, in your view, what kind of security threat will arise for the US when China succeeds in breaking the first and second island chains completely? And what kind of response will the US respond to it?
Yeah, look, I think we're getting to that point really in technological development. Really, when we talk about cyberspace, but also when we look at intercontinental ballistic missiles, and even space itself, I think we're getting into a region, especially we'll see in the next, I would say, 5 to 10 years, for instance, that idea of those island chains being significant choke points for China, and even significant areas of strategic competition, for instance, between those two militaries. I think we'll see that become less of an issue, especially as cyberspace begins to dominate, let's say, that information space a little bit more. Because, I mean, you can have all the aircraft carriers that you want, all the frigates, and so on and so forth. But if you don't have the means to be able to protect them from some kind of cyber attack, from some kind of lethal autonomous weapon system, for instance, or from interballistic continental missiles, for instance, then being able to control those island chains, I think, is not going to really sort of add much of a difference there. Look, it's important for China, and it will be a milestone once it happens. And again, it'll be a milestone in the way that it can illustrate to the world the growth of its development in those technologies, that it has become a military power, a naval military power, for instance. But I think by the time that it does get there, I think that we will see the emergence of those security platforms, or insecurity platforms, however you like to view it, those lethal autonomous weapons and other systems, and those space systems as well, will probably begin to overtake the importance of those naval spaces. I mean, there'll be a lot of people, I think, who will disagree with that assessment, but I think in the coming 5 to 10 years, we'll definitely see an emergence in that area, where that particular space will become less important than it is currently today.
Just ask one update question. How do you evaluate the speech given by President Xi Jinping on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China in terms of the US and China relation? Look,
I mean, there's a couple of ways that we can analyze that particular speech, right? First of all, it's probably the most important speech that Xi Jinping has made so far, and if there aren't any significant wars or greater challenges, for instance, that he may ever make in his political time in office, for instance. So it is very significant, and what that means is that when you are particularly loose with terms, he talked about broken skulls, for instance, and bloody bones, and cracking heads of those, for instance, who are seeking to breach the steel Great Wall of Chinese security, for instance. When you very loosely use those terms, right, you're not demonstrating to the world that you are a responsible power, right? That you are a benevolent power, that you are not seeking some kind of hegemonic domain, if not internationally, then at least within your region. So, and why I point this out is because there's been a bit of a discussion, right, among Chinese scholars that say, well, you know, that particular phrase that he used, for instance, was it "to po xue liu," for instance, that shouldn't be taken literally, that it should reflect more sort of on a situation that conveys total failure, right, on Western governments, the United States, for instance, if it attempts to say, you know, step in between China and Taiwan, for instance. But for, you know, many outside of China, you know, have taken that very differently, because when you take that in the context of the national security law in Hong Kong, the arrest of many peaceful protesters, for instance, when you take that in the context of you know, the incarceration of up to 1 million people from different minority groups in northwestern China, for instance, for whatever reason, right, that doesn't look so friendly, right? And when you're using such terms, broken skulls and bloody bones, for instance, right, you're not conveying a very positive scene for the rest of the world, or peaceful scene for the rest of the world. And that's the major issue here. So, look, it was, I mean, the speech was always going to be for domestic audiences in China, and it was received very well inside China. But it shouldn't come as a surprise for Chinese scholars that people in the West, specifically, but also outside the West, have taken that very differently, right? And that China has become, that it's a reflection, an illustration of China's aggressiveness and its assertiveness, but also of things to come as well, right? You can't simply just use that rhetoric and then, you know, in the next sentence say something that you know, or the next speech, for instance, down the road, that, you know, China doesn't invade, it doesn't seek external possessions, and certainly doesn't seek to impose its will on the world or on the region. I mean, in Australia, that looks very differently, for instance, where China's will has attempted to be imposed. Certainly for nations in South China Sea, for instance, who also have claims to certain islands and possessions there. So, look, my sort of my quick, you know, 30-second take is that you know, we need to take it in the context that it's domestic audiences. However, it's not a positive speech, I would say, because if your point really is to, you know, to really hone in on that focus solely on the Chinese Communist Party, which is very much been Xi Jinping's mandate since 2014, then that's a problem. And if you're building up those nationalistic impulses within China, while also increasing, you know, military incursions into Taiwanese airspace, while also crippling human rights and freedoms in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, and in trying to impose your will over the region more broadly, then it's going to read as very hypocritical and negative. And so it's been taken as quite negative, but again, no real surprise there either. We've been watching Xi Jinping for quite some time, so no real surprise. I don't think it will get much of a response, you know, from headquarters around the world.
Amid the rising tension between the US and China, is there a possibility of a war between the US and China? If yes, where will be the flashpoint? Taiwan Strait, East China Sea, South China Sea, or another place?
Look, I think the possibility is always there. There's a number of important reasons for why that may be the case. Number one is that we know that, you know, with a lack of interaction and engagement, that there, you know, echo chambers are likely to emerge in key policy areas, right? You know, who is influencing the policymakers, for instance. Just to give you an illustration, I was at a conference. The last time I was able to go to a conference in China was 2019, and we were speaking with a number of very key senior scholars there who have access to certain policymakers in China, and they were saying very explicitly that it had become the situation in China, in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of censorship and those areas, it had become almost impossible to be able to talk about engagement with the West. Very difficult to talk about. Very difficult to talk about areas of cooperation, or why there should even be cooperation and engagement with the United States and China. So that says to me that there's a lack of discussion going on, and that was in 2019, and I think that likely to be exacerbated since that particular time. I would say that would also, I mean, we can see this under the Trump administration, and certainly to some extent in the Biden administration as well. So that lack of communication, I think, is important. The other major factor here for me is, as I touched upon before, the possibility for miscalculation and mistakes, accidents, and misperception. As we see more heightened responses from Chinese military in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Straits, for instance, and even heightened responses from the Quadrilateral Security Initiative countries such as Australia, Japan, the United States, and India. Okay, we're seeing a space that is now overly crowded with military and paramilitary vessels, right? So when you have an exponential increase in those vessels, right, you're going to have a similar increase in the potential for those flashpoints. So it's hard to say. Look, I mean, looking at the moment, I would say the number one flashpoint is certainly Taiwan. And the leadership in Taiwan have been watching what has been happening in Hong Kong very closely. We're seeing an unprecedented, not unprecedented, but certainly a huge growth in leadership changes and relationships between Washington and Taipei, for instance. Something that hasn't really happened since 1979. So that is a big development as well. And one of the major concerns here is that it's going to turn into something of a negative spiral, a security dilemma, if you will, where tit for tat responses are made on either side when it comes to Taiwan. And we see some kind of miscalculation, some kind of misperception, a lack of understanding of signals, perhaps, for instance. And there is an escalation, miscalculation, or some kind of accident. So look, there's always a possibility. I would say really since 2015, but certainly since 2018 onward, that possibility has grown. I won't assume to put a number out of 100, for instance, that possibility at the moment. But I would say it's far too high for my liking, put it that way.
My last question will be theoretical question. Adam, as you are a long-term analyst on U.S. China relations, do you predict that any possible power transition from U.S. to China in coming years, such as beyond 2050 or like that?
2050? It's difficult to see that far ahead. I mean, events take place in weeks and months and barely years these days. I mean, that's part of the problem is keeping up with all the events. So to think about 2050, look, I think we've seen already, to an extent, a power transition regionally in the Indo-Pacific to some extent. I mean, the United States simply cannot send an aircraft carrier group through the Taiwan Straits anymore like it used to be able to do. China has very significant capabilities, area access, area denial capabilities, for instance, in and around its littoral waters. So there is, and of course, with China's very impressive economic growth and its importance, its economic importance to regional nations and neighbors, for instance, then yeah, there has been, to an extent, a power transition regionally. More broadly, I don't think we will see one, and that's for two major reasons. First of all, is that I think as we do begin to see power sort of recede, perhaps strategically and militarily in the United States, I don't think that is going to be fueled by Chinese power. I think, and I think this is why the quadrilateral security initiative is very important here, because we are seeing the rise of middle powers and upper middle powers coming to the equation in the Indo-Pacific. Japan is very important here, and India is going to be crucial to that particular power dynamic as well. So, even if American power declines more regionally, Southeast Asia, for instance, and in East Asia, we will see a growth, I think, in multilateral power dynamics. So I don't think it's not going to be, again, a win-win for China here, if we see a decline in American power. And simply, America cannot simply match Chinese military power on its own borders. And let's not forget that the United States is a global military power with something like 800 military bases as well. China will need to do a lot that it's not currently doing to achieve something like that. And look, if I look at what's 2020, next 30 years, current trajectory, I would say no. China's not going to be able to replace the United States as a global military power by that stage, even if American power declines. And simply because it doesn't have the power, it doesn't have the soft power that the United States has. It doesn't have the alliances that the United States has, NATO, for instance, among others. It doesn't have that attraction or even the dollar power that the United States has. And these are very important points, and it's also partly illustrative of why China attempted to develop the Belt and Road Initiative, right, to be able to internationalize the RMB, to be able to take away from some of that dollar dominance in the United States, which has largely failed to do so. So I don't see Chinese power overtaking American power internationally, at least anytime soon. Regionally speaking, I would say we've already seen somewhat of a transition, but we won't see a complete transition. The United States is not going to go away. It's in its national interest to be in the Indo-Pacific, to make sure that the waterways between the Malacca Straits, for instance, and in the South China Seas, for instance, that very important artery, for instance, for world trade, they have a very strategic interest, national interest, for instance, in making sure that those lines of communication stay open, and that is not controlled by any one country. Look, and in that interest as well, it has a lot of support for those surrounding countries. So no, I don't think we'll see a power transition broadly between with China overtaking the United States.
Now, end of the program, I would like to give time to your latest co-authored manuscripts, U.S. Foreign Policy and China Security Challenge during the Bush, Obama, and Trump administration. Can you a little bit tell us about your books, please? Because it is mostly related to our program and valuable information, I think, inside.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep. So look, what is it? U.S. Foreign Policy and China security challenges during the Bush-Obama administrations. That's with Edinburgh University Press. That was released this year. And basically it looks at the key similarities, but also the key policy departures between those three administrations, with a focus more specifically on the Trump administration and how he differs specifically from his predecessors. We know that Trump is more of a strongman, that his particular leadership was more, I would say, that the implications of his leadership were felt more strongly in the areas of foreign policy, but specifically when it came to security challenges with China, North Korea, for instance. We didn't see any improvement with North Korea and denuclearization or between China in that particular trilateral issue there. What did Trump leave us with when he left office? Well, a trade war that is still ongoing, for instance, between the United States and China, and really hasn't been beneficial to either party. We did get the Indo-Pacific strategy. We did get more focus on the Indo-Pacific as a strategic area, but I mean, we also saw great bluster there as well. Great bluster and mistakes with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with a lack of leadership in focusing on members of ASEAN, for instance. So there were many mistakes in the Trump administration, but mistakes that were, that we can see in Obama and Bush as well. Bush didn't have the time, focus, nor the resources to be able to focus on Asia, for instance, Northeast Asia and the Asia Pacific. With the ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. While the Obama administration attempted to pivot to the Asian Pacific or rebalance its military, economic, and strategic resources to that particular area, we saw an attempt in the first administration with Hillary Clinton as the Secretary of State to do that, but it wasn't very successful. I mean, we only have to take the Trans-Pacific Partnership over that 6 to 7 year period, which just missed out on being, they weren't able to really talk up the significance of that particular institution in the United States to get that ratified. So that was an important lost chance there for the Obama administration. And what we also see with the second Obama administration is really a change in the concentration of the Obama administration, more back towards the Middle East. Of course, we have the rise of ISIS, for instance, in Syria, and the situation with Syria. We had the Arab Spring in 2012, which of course exacerbates 2013, 2014. And then we have the issue with Iran, again, an issue that was largely abrogated by the end of the Obama administration. And this is something that Trump truly ruined, I would argue, and has created essentially a problem, a non-problem, or what should have been a non-problem for the Biden administration. So my book with my co-author Aidan Warren there attempts to really sort of navigate those interests, those key departures, but also those key similarities as well. It attempts to look at the China threats and how it and the vicissitudes of that particular threat in the United States over time. There were flare-ups in the early Bush administration, again in 2005. We saw that with more so the conservatives under the Obama administration. And then we see that greatly with the Trump administration, and more or less with the Biden administration, although less in terms of his rhetoric, for instance. So it does make some predictions. It's just that, with COVID-19, for instance, things are certainly going to get worse before they get better. Certainly in terms of global governance, the push and pull on international legal bodies and institutions between China, but certainly the United States as well, with the WTO, for instance, the World Health Organization, the UN Security Council, and some of the real letdowns there over the course of those administrations.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you for joining me today for providing great knowledge. Thank you for audiences. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel for next program about ASEAN Pacific affairs. See you in next program.